Good evening, everyone. It's your girl, Marcy Thomas, and I'm so happy to be back with you for another episode of the BGC Book Club. So please come on in the room, invite all of your book-loving friends to join us in this space because we are about to have a really great conversation with an author that I really enjoyed meeting her behind the scenes a couple minutes ago, and I also really loved reading her book. So I am coming to you from the outskirts of Atlanta, Georgia, originally from Cleveland, Ohio, and I've lived a whole bunch of other places in between. So I always love seeing who's here. So if you don't mind, just drop in the comments where you're joining us from, just so we can kind of get an idea of who all is represented on today. So as I said, I'm really excited about this book that I had a chance to read over the last 24 hours, really, because I like to read right before I do the conversations, just so everything is fresh and the story is really resonating with me. So tonight I'm excited to talk about the Grand Paloma Resort, which has been out for about 4 weeks now, and is by the wonderful Cleyvis Natera. Now, she was born in the Dominican Republic and migrated to the United States at the age of 10, and she grew up in New York City. She holds a BA from Skidmore College and an MFA from New York University. Her writing has won awards and fellowships from the International Latino Book Awards, PEN America, the Bread Loaf Writers Conference, the Kenyan Reviews Writers Workshop, the Vermont Studio Center, the Hermitage Artist Retreat, Roland Writers Retreat, and the Virginia Center for Creative Arts. That's a lot, and I had to slow down, so I was trying to talk too fast. She is currently a Fulbright specialist who is also an educator where she teaches bilingual and a bilingual MFA creative writing program. So without further delay, I want to bring our special guest for the evening on, and that is Cleyvis Natera. Welcome.
Cleyvis. Hello. Hi, Marcy.
Hello. I'm so excited to have you here. I was getting tongue-tied trying to tell everybody about all the wonderful things that you've done, but it's such a pleasure and an honor to have you here.
It is my privilege to be here with you, and thank you so much for such a kind intro. And I'm so happy to hear that you just read the book in the last day.
Yes, I do. I read, and just to let you and everybody else know so that they know, those who like audio, it is on audio. So I did some reading and I did some listening. So I got a little taste of both and really diving into the story. So that's always good to kind of see it from both perspectives. So again, congratulations on this. And this is your second novel. So how does it feel this time versus maybe the first time you put a book out?
Oh my goodness. I mean, the feeling is incomparable. I tell people, especially my students, I teach both graduate school and also undergrad, a lot of aspiring writers. And I tell them it's just a beautiful feeling to have like a book in your hands. Mm-hmm. I have 2 young children. I have an 11-year-old and a 13-year-old. And it feels like that, like when you're holding a baby and you're like, I love this baby more than the whole world. Like that's how I felt with each of my books. The first book was a long journey. It took me 15 years from the first sentence to publication. And with this second book, I actually sold the book as a proposal.
Wow.
So I didn't finish writing it. I sold it in 2023. I had been writing it for many years as short stories, but I did sell it in 2023 before I was finished. And so the whole process was so different and unique because I was writing it under pressure, under a deadline. But there was, a little bit more of a feeling of accomplishment because also I knew that it would be published in 2025. And that was a great feeling.
Right. And we did not mention the name of the first book. That's Neruda on the Park, correct?
Yes, that's right.
Okay, so that one got a lot of awards and a lot of buzz as well.
Yeah, it did well.
Yes. So for those who haven't had a chance, pick that one up as well. So for the Grand Paloma Resort, I really devoured the book because there's so much happening in this particular story. There is the resort itself, it's the people in the Dominican Republic, it's the history, it's just so much that's happening. So I guess my first question for you, Cleyvis, is what was it that really inspired you to tell this particular story?
Well, I mean, thank you so much. I started writing the book in 2020 during the pandemic.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And at the time, I live in New Jersey, Montclair, New Jersey. And at the time, I was working a full-time job. I used to work a full-time job at an insurance company in the claims department.
Okay.
And so, I was running a claim team. I had like somewhere around maybe 40 people in the team. I had several, managers that work for me. My husband also worked a full-time job. We had these two children at home. All of a sudden, virtual school, and it was not smooth. Like now, you and I are on here is
Right.
smooth. We get on Zoom and it's smooth, but back then it was very rough and bumpy when we first started going virtual for the kids' school. And so there was a tremendous amount of pressure, in my daily life when we went on lockdown. And at the same time, I had just finished writing, editing Neruda on the Park with my agent. And we were just about to take the book out to market when, everything got shut down. And my literary agent said, we have to hold off because we have to wait until people are ready. The publishing marketplace had come to a halt.
Mm-hmm.
And so, during that time, I remember one of my girlfriends, my writing friends, was invited to guest edit a literary journal. And she wrote to me, Marcy, and she said, "Do you have a short story that you can send me?" And I had been thinking about these employees in this resort for a long time.
Okay.
I had been thinking about this. Anytime I travel back to the Dominican Republic, I would just pay attention when I stayed at a hotel. I would ask a lot of questions, have a lot of conversations. So this was an idea that I had in my mind, but I didn't want to interrupt the flow of my first book.
Gotcha.
And so, while the book was on hold because we couldn't send the Neruda in the Park into market, and my friend then invited me, I was like, you know what, let's go. I'm going to like give this story a shot. And the real, so those were the circumstances that led to the inspiration, because during the pandemic, I really started thinking about what if the airports never open back up. We're never able to travel again. And I felt this longing for my birthplace. I was like, oh, the beaches are so beautiful. The mountains are so beautiful. And at the same time, it's a country that has a very complicated history.
Yes.
And so for me, I honestly was thinking a lot about the beauty and how much I love being in my country of birth. And at the same time, I was thinking about, class and privilege and everything that is like the underbelly of tourism, and how much I wanted to tackle all of that in a book of, at the time, I thought it was going to be a book of short stories.
Okay. So that explains a lot, because as I mentioned, there are a lot of different things that you talk about in it. And so it kind of makes sense that it probably was a short story, because I could see how different parts of the book could have started that way and then just expanded into a cohesive story. So that does make a lot of sense. Mm-hmm. So for those who haven't had a chance to read the Grand Paloma Resort yet, just give us a synopsis of what the story is about.
Sure. So the Grand Paloma Resort is a novel that takes place over the course of 1 week. It is centrally concerned with two sisters, Elena and Laura, who both work at this luxury resort in the Dominican Republic. At the beginning of the story, we find out that Elena, who is 17 years old, has had an accident. Because of her negligence, a young tourist child has been harmed. Mm-hmm. And her older sister, Laura, who is, a middle manager at the hotel, decides that she really wants to teach this hard-headed, rebellious teenager a big lesson. And so she tricks her sister into thinking that something terrible has happened. And so over the course of the 7 days, we get to see like an escalating series of crises that come about because of that.
Mm-hmm. And it definitely is like, there's a whole bunch that's happening. and to think that it all takes place in a week. So I just have to ask you, from the perspective of telling the story, how challenging was it to put so much information in what is supposed to be a week's time? Even though we know in life, a lot of times, a lot of things can be happening in a week, but to actually write that and put it on paper.
Oh, it was very challenging. I mean, I remember when I first talked to my editor, Chelsea Johns, who's like an incredible editor. I started out with her. She acquired the book. And then toward the end of our process, she ended up getting a big promotion and she moved to another imprint. But I remember talking to Chelsea at the time, and she's so brilliant. And she said to me, I'm just not sure that we can get all of that done in 1 week. And Marcy, my first thought was challenge accepted.
Right,
I
right,
was
right.
so committed to having this book happen over 1 week. And so, my approach was, to start out with, I knew that the story was going to be really centrally concerned with the two sisters.
Right,
And
right.
so then I thought, okay, I already knew what needed to happen at the beginning and then where we would end up. And then I knew that I wanted to include other perspectives
Yes.
because it is about a resort. It is about employees at the resort.
Mm-hmm.
And then I also wanted to give a reader that sense of like the immensity of this place. So you do get to see and hear from some of the other characters. Some are, tourists who are staying at the resort. Other people are, community members who don't work at the resort. And so, once I figured out like the whole cast of the characters, then it became easier for me to say, okay, as long as I'm keeping the tension and the suspense
Mm-hmm.
of the book, then
Mm-hmm.
I can kind of move the reader from, day to day. Because from the beginning, it's like day one is a Thursday. So
Yes.
maybe you don't know right away, but then we go to Friday, we go to Saturday. So then I think people kind of
Mm-hmm.
understand. And I really wanted the book to be an escape. I felt like, oh, if I can make people think like this is an escape from your life, and we're
Mm-hmm.
gonna go day by day.
Yes, yes, and it definitely was. And really, if you think about it, in the course of a 24-hour day, let's take the 16. If you just say you actually sleep for 8 hours, there are a lot of different things that happen in the course of the day. And as you mentioned, with it being other people and them maybe observing or giving their point of view of the things that are happening within the story, it definitely makes sense. But it's just like, whoo, that's a lot. That was quite a week.
It's definitely a big week. You and I would not want a week like this.
No, I would not want a week like this. I would not want a week like this. So, as you mentioned, the story centers around two sisters who are working at a resort in the Dominican Republic. But one of the things we won't talk about, the actual resort itself in a moment. But one of the things that really stood out to me is that in the telling of the story, you really do talk about the history of the Dominican Republic, at least in on the context of the story, as well as relationships with Haiti, which is right next door. So that's something that for me, I felt like I learned a lot because there are things that I just, I don't know about it. But to even think about, what it means to be in these places and the people that will be working there and the community that surrounds these beautiful places. So I know that was important for you to include that in the story, but it's also very timely.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
It
Just to
was
think, go ahead.
No, I mean, I'm so grateful that you're bringing this up because, the first time that I learned about, one of the things that I wanted to touch on is the dynamic between Haiti and the Dominican Republic because it is such a troubling history between the two countries. And yet, I feel like it is probably one of the most difficult things to talk about as a Dominican person because the history of the way that the Dominican Republic has treated, both Haitians of, Dominicans of Haitian descent and just the migrants. Right now there is, a very big crisis happening in Haiti. And it was just really important to me to reflect that in the book because the book is supposed to be happening in contemporary times. And so the one thing that I would tell you, because I'm so grateful that we're starting here from the book, because I was thinking a lot about family and about siblings, right? It's about like two sisters. And at the same time, I think of Hispaniola, which is the island, as like two sisters, the
Yes.
Dominican Republic is on one side and Haiti is on the other side. And it has been a very troubling sibling relationship between the two countries. And, the starting point for me in learning about the history wasn't in school and it wasn't through my
Right.
family.
Mm-hmm.
Even though I went to school, through the halfway through the fifth grade. When I left, I was 10 and I was halfway through fifth grade when we migrated to the United States. And it wasn't until I was in my 20s, Marcy, that I read Edwidge Dantica's The Farming of Bones. It
Yes.
was the first time through that book that I learned about the Parsley Massacre, which was a genocidal event that happened in the Dominican Republic in 1937. Tens of thousands of Haitians were massacred at the mandate of the Dominican government, of the then dictator Trujillo. And because I learned about that through a novel, and I'm a huge fan of Edwidge Dantica. She's been a huge inspiration for me and a source of a lot of thought about what literature can do. And so there was a part of me that, anytime that I travel back to the Dominican Republic after I read that book in my early 20s, I really would think like Amabel, who is the protagonist of that book. And she was, a worker, a domestic worker in a home of like very wealthy people, wealthy Dominicans. And every time I traveled to DR, I would like look around and look at what was happening with, Haitian people and Dominicans of Haitian descent. And, the situation has deteriorated for Haitians, right? Like they lost birthright citizenship. So a lot of people are stateless, right? Like people that were born in the Dominican Republic, but whose parents weren't citizens, lost their citizenship. And so, it's been kind of heartbreaking for me as a Dominican person to witness that. And so it was really important that when I was thinking about the history of the Dominican Republic and the political climate that exists today, that I would also root that in the reality and in the history of the two countries.
Yes, yes. So I think that's really important. And, even just looking at what's happening in the United States with something similar, because even though I know what I was reading about, in the back of my mind, I was thinking about like, what are some of the things that are happening in the US right now as well? So, but just to see that what we're seeing here is not just solely an American thing, that it can be happening in other places as well, with people deciding who belongs versus who doesn't and those sorts of things. So I just wanted to get that out of the way, because for me it was something to learn, because I didn't know either.
Yes,
so thank you for including that historical context.
Absolutely.
So of course we have these young ladies who are working at this resort, and we've already kind of talked about something happens that like sets everything in motion. But even prior to that, it's just that they're there and they're orphans, you may as well say. They are orphans. And so it's like there is a special kind of sibling relationship that they have that goes beyond a traditional sibling relationship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I thought a lot about the non-traditional relationships that, I have witnessed in my life. And, I think also because I'm an immigrant, I was fortunate that I've always had my mother. But there have been so many instances, Marcy, where like I witnessed my friends become pseudo parents to their siblings, their younger siblings, either through necessity because the parents were working so many hours out of the day, or really because the parents, for whatever reason, could not really step up to the plate to be good parents.
Right.
And so I've always been fascinated. Maybe it's because I'm a middle child, and I've always been kind of fascinated by like the older sibling versus the youngest baby sibling dynamic. I think it's just, at a certain point in my life, I wanted to either be my older sister or my younger sister, and I share the middle with my brother. And so, he's the only boy. So I always felt like, I got the short end of the stick being in the middle with like a boy. But it really has helped to animate my curiosity and my imagination, because I kept thinking about, Laura being someone who has truly dedicated her entire life to giving her younger sister, they are 10 years apart, which is a significant age gap.
It is.
And, she has dedicated her whole life. She started working at the resort because she really wanted to hustle a different kind of life for her sister. And then at the same time, all the sacrifices she has made hasn't yielded the kind of child she would like to have.
Right.
And so there's like a lot of resentment between the two sisters and a lot of love. And I thought that that would just be combustible to put these two young women in a dynamic where, like, over the course of 1 week, you're going to figure out who you are and what this relationship means to you, and whether or not you're going to continue together in this relationship.
And that is something just to think about when the dynamic is different from what it would be under normal circumstances. And yes, Lara is like parenting her sister, but she's like, but you're not my mama at the same time.
And she's also not a great mom. I mean,
she's
another thing too is that she's really not equipped because of her own trauma and like the hardships that she has gone through. She just has a mindset and an outlook in life that hasn't always led to generosity or kindness. And I think that's also really important to that dynamic.
Yes. And the fact that, and this is a conversation that I've often had with people, and I'm an only child. So like, you have your experience. I'm the only one. So I didn't have to,
You were spoiled. Say it. You were spoiled.
I'm not spoiled. I always say spoiled with love, not with stuff. Because I did not get it.
I mean, that's the best
I wanted. Yeah,
that is the best way to be spoiled, is with love and not material stuff.
Yeah, I didn't get everything I wanted, but spoiled with love. But just to think about what those relationships look like, how they can change, when you have a different type of dynamic, and the fact that because there is a 10-year difference when it comes to the parents, and we do learn some things about the parents in the story, they had two different experiences with their parents. And oftentimes that is the case. What one child may experience growing up is totally different from what the other child may experience, even if they have the same parents.
Yes, that's another thing that I feel in my own family. When I left the Dominican Republic, I was 10 years old, and my father stayed behind.
Okay.
And, my father suffered from Alzheimer's disease. He had early onset, because by the time I was 16 years old, he started to really lose his memory. And there were so many painful moments we had where we would call him, from the calling centers, and he would have no idea who I was. And I thought a lot about the fact, even though me and my siblings didn't have such a big age gap, my sister was 4 years older than me, and my brother was 2 years older. And sometimes we talk about who our parents were. And for example, my father, we were his last family.
Okay.
And he had a 20-year gap with my mother.
Okay.
In age. And so he had children from previous relationships that were, goodness, they had children that were older.
Right.
And so I just know that, there were certain conversations I had with some of those siblings who were, maybe 20 years older than us or 30 years older than us. And some of them, to be honest with you, had experienced a very different father. Like the father we had was doting, was at home, cooked for us, played with us, was retired, by the time we were children. And they had such a different experience. And so, I really was very inspired by, that aspect of my life, and to kind of give these two sisters such a different perspective of, we learned pretty early on that they lost their mother when they were very young. And that's why Laura ended up taking that motherhood role, because, their mom passed away when Laura was a teenager, and, Elena was, a toddler.
Right.
And so I think that the fact that, Elena has not even a memory of her mom, hardly any. And then the relationship she has with her father was very different than the relationship that Laura had. She really experienced kind of the better parts of her dad. And so, that was something that I really wanted to add to it, because I also think that the two sisters have really different relationships with the past. And so, like Elena, who's the younger, the teenager, she's very optimistic about the possibility of overcoming terrible things, and the fact that people can change and become better. And, Laura is not. She's very pessimistic. She's like, you cannot overcome the past. people that are rotten stay rotten.
Right.
And that really kind of taints the way that each of the sisters thinks about like the social circumstances in their lives, and also whether or not to try to effect change in their lives
Mhm.
individually.
Yes, and that is a big thing. I'm glad that's a good segue to where I was about to go, because with Elena, she really is, she's young. I mean, she's 17.
Yes.
And, she is, she's excited about life. She wants to do things. She is that person that really, she's looking at what's happening around her and she doesn't like it. And she's trying to figure out how she can step in and really support the people who are in this community who might be suffering in one way or another, because we didn't really touch on it yet, but the fact that this is a community where a lot of the people that live there, they are the only place they really can work is to work at this resort. There may not be a whole lot of other options, and even in that, they're not making tons of money, even working there, especially with the lower level jobs. But for Elena, and seeing that, it's like she wants to try to fight, and wherein Lara is more like, no, we just got to do what we got to do so we can get ahead.
Yes. Yes, it's a completely different mindset. And the other thing that I thought would be interesting with the two sisters is that because of Laura's, a lot of her sacrifices working, she started working as a waitress. She worked in the kitchen. She's worked, she's done all these service jobs to get to management level. But all of that has been to like enable her sister to have a different life, because she really doesn't want her sister to be in the service industry.
Right.
And so, one of the things that we learned early on is that Laura was able to, enable her sister to participate and to attend this very exclusive virtual global academy, which is really in place for the children of wealthy executives. But, Laura, that was one of the things she was able to work out for her sister. So when we meet Elena has just graduated from high school. It's August in the book. She graduated in June, And so one of the things that I really thought would be interesting, especially because the hotel conglomerate, Paloma Enterprises, is a US-based company. And so the high school, the Global Academy, is a US-based school. And so Elena has read, Audre Lorde and Nelson Mandela, and she's read, Toni Morrison, and she's read Edwidge Danticat, right? So she has read this kind of formative texts that have really helped shape her sense of the possibilities for social activism. And she is trying to enact social activism, but she doesn't really have like the real world applications to like.
Right, that's very true.
So sometimes when she's trying to like enact change and make revolution, she ends up making things worse for like the people she's trying to help. And so I thought it would just be really interesting to think about, because neither of the sisters has ever left the Dominican Republic. I thought a lot about, how my mindset and my optimism has been shaped by like books and literature and like these kind of like examples of like people who really made a difference in their countries and in their nations, especially when it comes to, race and class. And so I wanted to give Elena that kind of like a background, even though she's never traveled. She really does have the mindset of a foreigner in some ways.
Yes. She definitely does. And she wants to make change, make things better. And also just her youth. I mean, not to say all young people feel that way, but it makes sense. And the things that she's had the opportunity to learn and in this special school, and just being exposed to something different. But for me, in reading that, it's not, even though Laura is not her parent, it's not that much different than, say, if you have a parent who's like, hey, we just want to do what we got to do to get ahead. Let's work. Let's try to move up in the world, whatever. Let's not ruffle feathers. Let's just, that sort of thing. Wherein a younger person may come in and be like, nah, this is wrong. I want to see what I can do about it, whether they have the experience or not. So that clash is definitely understandable.
Yeah, I felt also with like my own sense of possibilities. I think when we're younger, we have a tendency to feel more fire, more outrage, when you look at things and how unfair it is. In the book, we understand that there have been like these raids and that they're kind of like taking the laborers and the people who are in the construction work. And they're like raiding these work sites and deporting people. And so Elena is one of those people who really feels like the weight of injustice in this very visceral way. And I thought, what a beautiful thing it is about being young. Because some of us, once you get older, you start to believe that it's impossible to effect change on a bigger scale. And so I also feel like even though the two sisters are only 10 years apart, it's a big generational shift, whether or not we think, right? And for someone like Laura, who has, had a lot of discomforts in her life, she knows the stakes are so high. She's not going to risk anything that might risk her job. And so a lot of her hesitation to take like kind of a higher moral ground are also rooted in the fact, like you said, she comes from a community that is poor, and that people don't always have the opportunities to get ahead without these kinds of jobs in the tourism sector.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I definitely want to talk about that because the whole story centers around the resort. These two young ladies, these two sisters, are like the lead characters, but there are other people, as you stated, that work on the resort, as well as people who are like resort adjacent.
Right, yes,
community of the surrounding community. But it really just got me thinking about the fact that you have these places, and in the Caribbean, where there are these great resorts that people want to go to, this wonderful, beautiful, all-inclusive, whatever it is, and how folks can come to these places and spend a whole lot of money and things like that, but not really thinking about the people who live in the community and what's really happening in the community. And, the fact that sometimes these people might be making pennies to the dollar of what somebody else is making and that sort of thing. So that wasn't really shocking to me, because I remember years ago my dad talking about going to Jamaica and being in places similar to this, and but yet you go off away from the resort and it's a totally different experience. So just to be able to see that and see that through the eyes of the actual people who are working, I thought that was pretty powerful to see that.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, my own experience, having been born in the Dominican Republic, is that, my mother and my father, they were working people. My mom used to work at a coconut factory. My father worked in, a construction kind of job. And my grandparents on my mom's side, who we were very close with, were farm workers. I mean, they had a lot of land. So we were very lucky growing up that the land really translated for us into more stability financially, even though, it wasn't our land, it was our grandparents' land. And, even though we, I would say we were like middle class or like, working class people in the Dominican Republic, it was so stark, Marcy, once I traveled back to the Dominican Republic as a college student, college graduate, once I got my graduate degree, once I became an executive in an insurance company. I mean, the more that my class changed as a consequence of being an immigrant, I felt like I had access to my country in a way that a lot of people with my background do not. And so I just thought that this idea of like how wealth or like a certain level of income can unlock resources within a country that are like not accessible to people from that same country, to me is crazy to think about it, especially, in the Caribbean, because it is like an absolutely gorgeous region of the world. And so, I really wanted to kind of show that stark difference between people who are like head down working 12, 14-hour days versus the people who go there and who, there's no real impetus for tourists to understand the history of a place or to understand the social dynamics. If anything, I feel like, I've heard people say, because I travel a lot and I listen to people, tourists on these vacations my husband and I go on. And, sometimes people are like, oh, it's so shocking how poor people are on the way to the hotel, And I feel like sometimes they also don't realize that the people that are serving you and cleaning the kitchen and making your meals, though, I mean, some of them, those are their living circumstances.
Right.
And so like to connect that, like your leisure and your access to these beautiful spaces are more often than not, created because of the inequality that
Mhm.
exists for people from those countries.
Hmm. And also just thinking about like land and other things, because the little bit of that comes up in the book as well, like land or spaces that might be of meaning to the people who are from there that have now been taken away from those people to build these hedonism. Isn't there a place called hedonism?
Yes, there is a place called hedonism.
Right, but yeah, in some cases that the stuff that's going on is pretty wild, and people are coming down there too. Not all people. Let's be
No.
clear, but some people are going there. With this whole, oh, let me go into this exotic place with these exotic people and have these exotic experiences. So that can be a part of it as well, and not really considering what the impact what impact it has on the people who are local to those places.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with you.
Hmm. One of the other things, because the story does take place in the Dominican Republic, and we talk about the Haitians as well. For me, it's also just understanding the African diaspora, because we hear all these diaspora wars and things like that. When I'm like, we black, that's me. That's my take on it. We're black. But just to understand that there are people who are black who might be Spanish speaking or French speaking or whatever, depending on where they are in the world, but that there is still an interconnectedness of having that African heritage. So I could appreciate that in the book as well.
Oh, thank you, Marcy. I mean, so much of like my racial awakening, because I too consider myself a black person in the world.
Right.
And, I remember when I was in college, I had two best friends. Gina was black from Harlem, American, and my friend Rachel was from Trinidad and Tobago, true Trini, and
Mhm.
the three of us were so different, in our backgrounds. I grew up in Harlem, so Gina and I had a lot in common from growing up in the city. And then, I'm from the Caribbean, and so my friend Rachel and I. But it was the first time outside of the context of, being Latina, that I understood in college that I was a black person, and it
Mhm.
happened to me when I was, my freshman year. And I remember coming back home from college, during the break, and telling people like, we're black. And in my Hispanic community, it was like, no, we're not, and this is 20
Mm.
years ago,
Mhm.
honestly, before we had like Afro Latinos or Afro
Mhm.
Dominicans. We didn't have that language. And there
Right.
was a lot of pushback, because even my black friends that I went to, elementary school with, and that I went to high school with, were like, you're not black, don't call yourself black. And
Mm.
so it seemed to me, to be honest with you, like that during college, because I had that racial awakening, when I would go back to the Dominican Republic, I did feel a solidarity with Haitian
Mhm.
people, because I felt like my experience in America as an immigrant, to me, lined up more squarely with like the experience of Haitians in the Dominican Republic, who were considered
Mhm.
an underclass, right? And
Mhm.
so there have been so many times when I think, I think about it now. I'm in my 40s, and I think about being a teenager, being 18, and then all the way through my 20s, when I was traveling back to the Dominican Republic, and how my sense of solidarity lined up with Haitian people, I think largely because I had this racial awakening. And so in this book, I really wanted that sense of being diasporic people, and the
Mhm.
fact that there's like so many tie-ins with the enslavement of black people in America, and how like some people that were like newly freed or escaped enslavement traveled to the Caribbean. I feel like we don't talk about that enough.
Right. Right.
There was like a huge influx of people from Philadelphia that happened in the 1800s into the Dominican Republic. And, I just think that to me is so fascinating. And again, nothing I learned in school, in America or in the Dominican Republic. And I'm like, there are so many points of connection and solidarity between
Yeah.
us. And it is not by mistake that we don't know about them. I mean, I think that these are like intentional points of contention where, there's like so many tensions between our communities, when in reality we're like one people.
Right. Because there's a scene in the book where people are like preparing meals, and I'm like, okay, what they're preparing sounds different, but what they're putting in what they're preparing sounds the same.
And I was very intentional.
So it's like, okay.
I was very intentional in thinking about okra and thinking about other kinds of food that like really traveled in those ships. And so I think it's like just really important for us. There is no way that we can deny the fact that, depending on our language and depending on our cultures, we are very different people. Right. But I also think that there is a lot more that we have in common based on the way that we are treated, based on the way we present as Black people in the world. And I know that there's just so much power in that, in understanding it, in like embracing it, in embracing each other. I mean, that's one of my aspirations, is that from this book, even though these two sisters are a hot mess,
they are a hot mess.
I also hope that, we understand that like as a people, we have come like this family, these two sisters have come from a lot of pain and a lot of trauma, but that there is something hopeful and beautiful about the journey that can lead to like their freedom.
That can lead to their freedom. Absolutely. So yes, it's things like that. And this is why I'm bringing it up, because of course we can't tell you all the stories. So I'm kind of going around it and giving you themes without having to tell you everything that's happening in the story. One more thing I just want to mention just briefly about the cultural thing that we see with Lara is that she is this woman who's climbing up the corporate ladder, right? And so there's a thing about the hair, like what do I do with my hair and all of that. So just to know that that's a part of it as well, that she's thinking about that, just like we, Black American women might have to think like, okay, I need to wear my hair, or I need to present a certain way if I'm looking to move up in my career and things like that. So, those things are real.
The respectability politics, I think, are one of the things that I realized when I was a young professional. And I got my little ponytail on right now, but my hair is like kinky hair. And so I just remember when I was first entering the workplace, just being so worried about what my hair was doing, and like always being hyper aware of whether or not the hair was behaving in the way it needed to behave for me to be taken seriously and be listened to. And, I think a lot of times when people, and it's so interesting, Marcy, because I've had some reactions from readers who are not women of color.
Okay.
Who are like, what's going on with Laura's hair? Like, she's just so obsessed with it. And then Black women and Latinas are like, oh my God, I am so there with Laura.
Right.
Preoccupation with her edges, her preoccupation with this weave. And she has a very badly behaved weave.
Yes.
And so, it's important to me as like a professional woman to also acknowledge that as women of color, when we are in a work environment, especially if it's a professional work environment where people think that in order for you to look presentable, you're supposed to have straight hair. It's just really important for me to like add that dimension, because there are a lot of people that show up as they are and never have to worry, right? And there are some of us that it takes quite a bit of effort to get to a point where we don't worry about the way we look. For some of us, that's not even possible.
Right. That's true. Oh, Jean has a comment. She came in late to tonight's convo, but I enjoy Cleyvis's IG post and applaud her continued success. Thank you so much for showing up.
Jean. I hope you're having a great night. Thank you for saying hello.
Yes. And she's an author as well, so check her out.
Yes.
But yes, just thinking about those things, but in the context of the story, we've already talked about the fact that the sisters are a mess. We already know that there's this event that happens early on where, there's some misunderstanding and a whole lot of things happen because of that misunderstanding. But in the midst of that, we do get introduced to some other characters besides just Lara and Elena as they're going through this whole process. One of the people that really stood out to me, who to me, he's like maybe the third lead, and that's Pablo, because we get to learn a
Mhm.
lot about Pablo, who also works at the resort, and he is having a different type of trajectory as a male in this space.
Yes, I mean, I had so much fun writing Pablo because, Pablo is, to me, he's like a really interesting character because he's somewhere between Elena with his optimism and then
Mm-hmm.
also has kind of like a realism that comes from Laura and like also
Right.
the way that he believes. I mean, Laura and Pablo have really drank the Kool-Aid of this corporate environment. They
Mm-hmm.
believe that their path to freedom and success and happiness is going to be through their ambitions and through their succession in this corporation. And Pablo is willing to do things that really fall outside of what most of us would consider acceptable behaviors.
Absolutely.
And so,
Absolutely.
I think it's so interesting because, very early on, I don't think this is a spoiler to say that like Pablo is, one side of like the sexual tourism
Mm-hmm.
experience that people have.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the things that, I found out because, I interviewed a lot of people that worked in hotels because I
Okay.
myself have never worked in a hotel
Mm-hmm.
or a resort. And so, especially after I saw the book in 2023, I became a lot more methodical about interviewing, people who worked in the hotel, people who were like upper levels of management to understand the pressures and dynamics, but
Mm-hmm.
also laborers and people who worked the land, who constructed these mega luxury resorts in the Dominican Republic. And one of the things that I learned is how often men feel pressure
Mm-hmm.
to like have sexual relationships with tourist women, but they're not compensated. They're not doing it for sex. I mean, they're not doing it for money. And
Mm-hmm.
so I thought a lot about how I could do this with delicacy in a way that again would help illuminate the power dynamic.
Yes.
We're all adults. People can make decisions about what they're willing to do or not willing to do with their bodies. But there is something to me that feels really important and urgent about that power dynamic, especially
Mm-hmm.
when it comes to the Caribbean. And in my experience from reading other books where we talk about the sex trade, we talk about it from the perspective of women.
Yes.
And I just feel like people just kind of don't seem shocked or alarmed when it happened. And so a lot of times I feel like if you try to tell the story from a perspective that's unusual, maybe it'll help to like really illuminate what is the challenge of that, or like at least to raise some questions for readers. And so, I had fun with Pablo because Pablo is just out there doing his thing.
Yes, he is. He definitely is. I'm like, okay, Pablo, do you have to do that? Y'all got to read it. Like, but I mean, but just to think about again, as you said, someone who is striving and who wants to get ahead and wants something better, and sometimes it has to figure out who do I want to be to get to where it is that I want to be, and
And
that
who do
that
you harm also?
yes,
Because
who do you harm?
I think that the fact that Pablo, is in love and he's trying
Yes,
to like create this better life for someone he loves, much like Laura has been trying to make a better life for her sister. But Pablo is also misguided in the way
yes,
he's doing it because the person he loves isn't even interested in the things that he's trying to
right,
facilitate. And
right.
so for me, it was also really important to have that romantic relationship be, because I'm always thinking about love and the way that love can be such a powerful tool for us
Yes,
as humans.
yes,
But love can also lead us astray. Like sometimes, because you love someone, you make assumptions and then you're trying to do things that the person might not even want.
yes. We definitely see that in his relationship that he has with Vita, with
Mhm.
Vita. That yeah, he's doing stuff, and she's like, "You gonna stop doing that? Because I don't care about whatever X, Y, and Z." So, but that's something, and also to bring in the fact that there are men who are involved in these things, because we oftentimes will hear about males who go down to certain places and they're having these relationships with women, but to understand that men are doing some of the same things as well. You know, it makes me think back when How Stella Got a Groove Back was popular.
Yes.
And men be like, okay, my woman going, you know, make sure your woman not going down there to get her groove back. But I mean, it's something that's real. It's something that's real.
It's very real. And even now, I mean, I'm telling you, the idea that like women travel for sex as much as men travel for sex, we don't talk about that.
Right.
You know, and so I'm so glad that you're mentioning it, because there is something to me that we sometimes make assumptions that like, oh, men must not mind it, you know. But it's still a power dynamic, and it still is exploitation.
It definitely is. Dawn, we have a comment from Dawn Turner. I love this conversation so much. I can't wait to read the Grand Paloma Resort. This conversation is inspiring. Thank you for being
here. Dawn, thank you for popping in.
Hey, yes, thank you so much. So yes, there are a lot of things that are happening, and we're seeing people behave badly. So with that being said, the characters that you have are complex characters, and sometimes they're making bad decisions that may not make them as likable. So for you as a writer, how does it feel to craft characters who may not always necessarily be likable?
Well, I mean, thank you for that question, Marcy, because I have to tell you, I mean, I was so nervous writing this book. You know, I love complicated women, but like most of us, I have a hard time sometimes following the trajectory of someone who I don't feel empathy or sympathy for. And, you know, one of the things that I understood very early on was that Laura and Elena were going to be very complicated women. And, you know, I was trying to figure out like, what is the best way for me to craft them in a way where I'm not making them caricatures. I'm not talking about them like they're monsters. You know what I mean? Like, I think they're women, young women, you know, one of them I would consider a child, because 17 years old, you're still, your brain is still developing. And, you know, and I think Laura also is someone who's still young. She's 27 years old during, you know, the duration of this week. So, you know, I went back and I read every single book that Jamaica Kincaid ever
Okay.
I think Jamaica Kincaid is the most brilliant living writer, you know, when it comes to crafting complicated women. And, you know, reading, because I had been reading Jamaica Kincaid throughout my life. You know, I started reading her in high school at some point. You know, I remember having one of her books assigned to me. And then in college, I read her. And then, you know, I would always keep reading her books. And, you know, I thought it was so interesting because so many times I heard, you know, Miss Kincaid talking about how she really doesn't adhere to these ideas of genre. So if you read all her books, you know, the fiction and the memoirs, you realize that there are times when she's really talking about herself, or like some of these characters that she fictionalized where at least had like a very strong connection point. And so I feel like Jamaica Kincaid really helped me to be very brave and to let these characters be messy and complicated and unlikable, because I think that the truth is that I also wanted to push against this kind of narrative that we sometimes see in the Caribbean, that if you're poor or if you're a working person, that you're some kind of saint. I think there is so much in our communities, right? If we are honest with ourselves, you know, some of the reason why people within our own communities are exploited is because there are people within our communities that facilitate that.
That's true.
And so, you know, sometimes we self-harm, but sometimes we benefit from our own neighbors being harmed. And so I really thought, you know what, I'm going to go for it, because I feel like I have something really important to say about complicity and corruption. And I wanted to really use these characters, but at least, you know, also show their humanity. And not do it in a way that felt flat.
Right. It's definitely showing their humanity, is because even though they're complicated and sometimes they're doing stuff that you're like, what? Like, why did you do that? But we also understand why. Right. So I think that sometimes it's easy to villainize someone or make someone a monster or a bad person, whatever it is that you do. But being able to kind of see a little bit into their interior world to understand why they're making the decisions, you still might not like the decision that they made, but at least you can have a better understanding as to why they made the decision.
Yes, and the other big question I had as I was writing this book, which I would like to invite, the Brown Girl Collective community to think about, is like, who deserves forgiveness? Because
Mm,
we know that we are living through times when unforgivable acts are happening every day, and we're watching them on our phones. We're watching them in the highest levels of government. We're watching people make unforgivable decisions. And one of the things that struck me, just as I've studied Latin America and I've studied Africa, like history of different countries, is that very often, like, the most powerful people who have caused the most harm they're like automatically forgiven, right? There
right.
are things
Right.
in place that kind of
Right.
like shelter certain classes of people from ever facing, the kind of harm they cause. And so one of the things that I really wanted to have this book kind of meditate on is this idea, like, who is worthy of a second chance, who is worthy of forgiveness. And I want readers to really think about that with all these characters as they're making, some of them are making unforgivable decisions,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And that's what I want the readers to think about. Like, do you forgive these characters, or do you
Mhm.
feel like they shouldn't be forgiven? And when you think about society as a whole, when you think about government, when you think about, the global landscape and the harm that we see being done every day, does that like create a sense of outrage in your own spirit to see like the way
Mhm.
that there are certain people that just get forgiven by default?
Right. Right. Exactly. Exactly. And like certain people that are protected because of their connections or their resources and things like that. So you definitely don't shy away from those tough issues. In the midst of this story that, I told you at the top, I like got through it in less than 24 hours because I'm like, what's happening? Because even though I told you I listened to some, but I still, as I was listening, I was still like finding the stuff in the book. So I got a lot of places where I have tabs and stuff like that because I was listening, but I was also still reading at the same time in the actual book. So because there is not so much a who done it as much as what happened. There's a
Yeah.
situation that you're going to wonder what happened to some of the characters in the book, and we kind of see the whole process of figuring out what happened to those characters over the course of this 7-day period. And then that's also where some of the whole concept of forgiveness comes in, like what happens when the full story is out. And yeah, so it's good. It's definitely a page turner. It kept me engaged, and like when the parts when I was listening, somebody called me like, "Please don't call me right now. I'm trying to listen to this. I'm trying to see what's happening in Cleyvis's book. I
Oh,
can't.
no, that's music to my ears, Marcy.
I cannot talk to you right now." So, with that being said, the audio. Tell us a little bit about that for those who may prefer audio over reading. The reading hard copy.
Well, I am like you. Especially since I moved to the suburbs, so much of the books that I love, I consume them in audio form as I'm dropping my kids off to soccer practice and band practice. I'm in my car when I'm driving to book events. And so I love a good audiobook. And so, when they sent me the different voice auditions for this book, it just was something so like wonderful about these three women. Their voices were so rich, and I
Mm-hmm.
felt like, oh, they're gonna be able to bring this book to life. And I could not be happier with the result. I feel like, the audiobook, and I also read books like you. I'll usually get them in both formats. I'll go to the library. If I'm buying the audiobook, I get the hardcover from the library. Or if I buy the audio, then I'll borrow the paper book from the library. And so I'm usually toggling between both. And I am so happy with the way this audiobook turned out. I think it's just wonderful. And for people who are into multiple narrators, I think that it's also so fun to like switch the voice as different characters are taking the stage.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it was very enjoyable. So I did not want to not bring that up because it's definitely enjoyable. So can you believe it? We have made it. We've got through our hour. Can you believe that?
Yes. I feel like I could keep talking to you forever.
Yes. We don't want to do that to the people because they might be like, okay, y'all.
That's enough.
Yes, but I do want to ask you because I know that your book, Baby, is a little over a month old, right? So you are still in the process of doing like signings and events and things like that. Are there any places or spaces that you will be, for people who are watching this in real time, are there any places or spaces that you'll be coming up where people can come out and see you and get their book signed?
Yes. So I do have several events coming up now in September and October and November. I have an event coming up next week. I'm going to be in Provincetown in Massachusetts. Then I'm going back up to my alma mater to Saratoga Springs. That's Skidmore College. We're having a book festival in Saratoga Springs. I'm going to be up there for the weekend. In October, I'm heading to California. I'm going to be doing a keynote I'm going to be a featured speaker at Scripps College. And so for anyone who's interested, I'll be in Miami later for a Miami Book Festival. I would love to see everybody. I'm also coming to Portland. So if anybody's interested, they can go to my website and all of the events are listed there with the links, or you can follow me on Instagram, and I usually post the events there.
Perfect. Well, I know that you are an educator. How do your students feel about your book, or if they haven't had a chance to read it yet?
You know what? I mean, I'm so lucky because, aside from teaching undergrads, who I have to say, I don't hear as much from my undergraduate students when they read the book. When I see them on campus, they'll be like, I read that book. I loved it. But, my graduate students and then the students that I usually teach in summer intensives have been just so kind. I mean, the funny thing is that, there are certain things that I'm always hammering to them about, like staying in the present moment and about creating really complicated people in the page, these characters. And so it's, it's a special treat when my students are emailing me, or some of them have come while I've been on book tour and they've read the book and they're like, I can see what you were talking about in class. Right. I'm walking the walk. So I'm glad that they can see that I don't just expect people to do the things, that I'm also practicing those lessons in my own work.
I love that. You are training them up in the ways in which they should go.
We hope, I want all my students to publish their books and to experience the beautiful side of, after you do so much hard labor trying to work on these books, that you get to the other side of publication and you get to interact with wonderful people like you, Marcy. It's beautiful.
I appreciate that. And I should have brought that piece of paper in here, but there's some words of wisdom in here too that I snagged. I'll have to tell you what it is when we get done, because I don't want to bore them while I'm looking for it. But yeah, you get some little wisdom in here as well, just in telling the story and information that is passed along to the characters along the way. So yes, I really did enjoy reading this book. So Cleyvis, I thank you again for being here. I thank you for those who are watching now live, as well as those who will watch later. Of course, as we've already talked about, the book is available in audio. It's available at, bookstores. And I'll just share this real quick. There is a Brown Girl Collective bookstore, virtual bookstore. And it's just that Brown Girl Collective bookstore that's attached to Bookshop. So if you like to shop on Bookshop, you can go there. And then, of course, as Cleyvis has said, reach out to your libraries, just places, because everybody may not be able to purchase a book, but if they're available in the libraries, that's definitely a benefit to all who want to read. And this is just a last little plug. We need to make sure that we are reading more of books by our Latin sisters, by our Caribbean sisters, things like that. We need to support them just as well as we do African sisters, just the diaspora. There are women all across the diaspora who are writing great things, and I try to bring them here when I can, but it's just important that we read widely and support those that are telling our stories. So Cleyvis, I'm gonna let you grab some water, but don't hang up just yet. I just want to let everybody else know who's coming next week. So I'll see you in just a moment.
And well, thank you for having me, Marcy. This was such a pleasure. I really appreciate this.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll see you in just a second. That all the time, take myself off the screen. I'm not supposed to do that. But thank you to everyone for being here. Again, I appreciate you for being here and being a part of this conversation. I know it's my first time talking to Cleyvis, but I know it's not going to be my last because we didn't talk about it, but I know she's already working on something else. So I look forward to having her again. So on Monday, which is the 15th, I will be back with Jasmine Guillory. We'll be talking about her latest flirting lessons. So if you like romance, please come back for that conversation with Jasmine. And then a week from today, this is a memoir by Erica J. Simpson. This is Your Mother. So she will be here a week from today. All of these books are getting a lot of buzz. When I talk about bringing you good people, the best of the best, I'm not playing. So always show up here and you'll be introduced to or get an opportunity to speak to some of the best in the business. So I look forward to seeing you again real soon, and you all take good care. See you next week. Bye-bye.